Hey guys, so in my last video, I shared one of my favorite, almost forgotten video games from my childhood. That got me thinking about another game or game console that I haven't heard anything about in a really long time. This one is a bit easier to research and find stuff on, so I hope you guys are ready for a deep dive into the rise and inevitable fall of the V-Smile. I was a young kid in the early 2000s, and as you guys know, growing up in those years was wild. Less than 20 years ago, technology was so much simpler than it is today. I remember some of my friends' moms getting like those old BlackBerry phones, and it was revolutionary to be able to access your emails and stuff on the go. Now I try to avoid my email at all costs, but what do I know? Technology was changing really fast, and the internet was rapidly growing and becoming more accessible to everyday people. There were a lot of companies that were looking for ways to utilize technology as a tool. Of course, there were also a lot of conversations about how to make tech that was beneficial to kids, or at the very least, how to sell products to parents by claiming to be beneficial for your child's development. There were countless electronic kids' toys that were made with education in mind, but I want to talk about the one I remember the most, and that's the V-Smile TV learning system.
You'll never get into college if you don't play your video games.
Moms are now thinking of video games in a whole new way.
V-Smile was launched in August of 2004, and it was a follow-up to the VTech Socrates learning system. The Socrates learning system was released in 1988, but it faded into obscurity very quickly. It only had 9 games released for it before being phased out in the early 90s. This raging success obviously boded well for the V-Smile. So in 2004, VTech returns with the V-Smile TV learning system / game console. The capabilities of the V-Smile are usually compared to the Super NES or the Game Boy Advance in terms of graphics and sound, which means that, quote, the console is technologically comparable to most 4th or 5th generation consoles, despite being released in the 7th gen era of gaming consoles. Since they were designed for children and sold at a much lower price than the current 7th gen consoles, they were still decently successful. The V-Smile was targeted towards ages 3 to 8, and honestly, I think some of the features were pretty neat. For starters, the controller was designed to accommodate children's lack of dexterity. You could easily lay it in front of you or on your lap instead of holding it like a regular controller. And aside from the normal joystick and buttons, there was also a help button that would repeat instructions or give the player a hint. Another thing that I remember thinking was really cool at the time is the fact that the controller was ambidextrous. It had a small latch on the bottom that let you flip the joystick to be on either side of the buttons. I didn't know anyone who was left-handed then, but I remember thinking it was really cool because I'd never seen anything like it at that point. Later controller variants added other functions, like a writing pad and a stylus, but I never played with any of these later controllers. The V-Smile also had a compartment on top for storing all of your games. They called these smartridges, by the way. I think this worked well for something that's essentially a kid's toy. It makes storage really simple and younger kids can do it really easily. But now I want to talk about the actual games. V-Smile smartridges were typically a purple color, and they had a table of contents sort of showing what the educational content in the game was. There were about 70 games released for the V-Smile, and a lot of them are exactly what you'd expect. There were a lot of games with popular licensed characters like Batman, Dora, SpongeBob, and several Disney titles. And yes, there were Shrek games. Games were split into 4 categories based on age and difficulty. Beginners games for ages 3 to 5, Junior Thinkers from 4 to 6, Masterminds from 6 to 8, and some advanced titles for ages 6 to 9. I remember playing some of the V-Smile games, mostly the Disney ones. I know we had a Winnie the Pooh game that we played a lot, and I know we also had Nemo, Aladdin, Cinderella, and I think just like a generic Mickey Mouse game. Honestly, I don't remember much about the actual gameplay. There were a lot of levels based on matching like colors and patterns. Like I know in one of the Winnie the Pooh games, you're floating around with a balloon, and I think you had to avoid branches and collect items that were the same color as your balloon. I don't remember encountering any gameplay that was more advanced than that, but the games in the advanced category were probably, hopefully, a little more challenging. Overall, I remember my siblings and I playing the same few V-Smile games on repeat, It was a way for us to play video games and for my parents to play real games on the PlayStation at the same time. But of course, we also have to talk about why the V-Smile eventually failed. VTech's line of educational games were eventually criticized by entities such as the National Health Institute, who declared that the V-Smile Baby line of products did not actually meet any claims that the product would somehow nurture child education and or development. Simply put, they stated that children ages 0 to 2 do not understand what is happening on a TV screen. While these claims criticized the baby products, there were also criticisms of the original V-Smile. Common Sense Media wrote that despite all of the V-Smile's accommodations for children, the games were too hard for preschoolers, who lost interest because they didn't have the hand-eye coordination and patience required to complete game levels. With the V-Smile's reputation as a beneficial and educational product under fire, critics also took shots at the games themselves. They pointed out that there were next to no professionally developed games. Aside from their releases with Disney Interactive, VTech had no major third-party publishers as partners. Not to mention, these games retail for about $20, and they didn't offer that much gameplay. It's reasonable to assume that any educational benefit of the gameplay would be exhausted once your child already beat the game several times. This brings up one of the biggest reasons why the V-Smile failed. Aside from all the criticisms we discussed, and aside from their direct competition with Leapfrog and their products, the V-Smile essentially proved one thing. There just isn't a need for special electronics or game consoles for kids. If your child is too young to understand what's happening on the TV screen anyway, you probably aren't buying a ton of video games just for them. If you do want to expose your child to some kind of educational software, those products already exist on mainstream consoles, like the Xbox, the PlayStation, or even just your PC or mobile device. And most importantly, those mainstream consoles allow your child to grow with them. As your child gets older, you just buy them more advanced games. The V-Smile doesn't allow for this kind of growth. Once your child outgrows it, there's nowhere else to go, so you're stuck buying a new console anyway. Ultimately, as someone who grew up with a V-Smile, I enjoyed it back then. The games were simple and charming, and I enjoyed them, and so did my siblings. But the games I remember best, and the games I have the best memories with, are almost exclusively PlayStation and Nintendo titles. Those games were far more interesting, they were more challenging, and they continued to interest me as I grew up and transitioned from kiddie games to other things like puzzle games and shooters. So that's a brief history of the V-Smile. If you also grew up with a V-Smile, let me know if you remember playing any specific games. I can pretty much only remember the Winnie the Pooh one. If you grew up with a real console instead of this thing, good for you. We're in different tax brackets. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you soon.